Okay, we're ready to get started. Thanks everyone for your attendance today. Welcome to our latest monthly webinar installments. So for today on our agenda, we're going to spend the first part of this webinar really talking about how OpenAir handles utilization reporting. As with OpenAir in a lot of cases, there are a lot of different options for the system to perform the way that you would like it to. So we're going to kind of walk through those different options and kind of give you some tips and tricks on what we see our customers mostly benefiting from, and some of the little nuances that you might not be aware of that hopefully you can take advantage of in your business. So, and then we'll talk a little bit about capacity planning. For those of you who might have joined last month, we did a much more deeper dive in capacity planning and demand planning. So if you're interested in those topics, I would recommend taking a look at last month's webinar, but we'll touch briefly on that, as well as a little bit of forecasting around utilization. And then we'll also briefly talk a little bit about using some of the other features in OpenAir for finding the best resources. So this is kind of what we'll talk about today. So measuring utilization. Utilization to professional service organizations is like food, right? They can't survive without monitoring utilization, and it also is very diverse. Obviously we work with hundreds of customers, helping them maximize their value of their professional service organization, and a lot of them, many of them, all measure utilization differently. So the good news is, if you have OpenAir, you have a tool that will allow you to measure utilization based on this, how the organization computes it. So, but it's a critical metric for PS organizations. Obviously, we measure it and keep track of it. And if you're in a PS organization, you're not able to monitor your utilization in a one-click report or dashboards, then I would recommend you contact Top Step, and we can try to help you get there. Also, this webinar will be a big benefit. So obviously, what is utilization made of? Utilization obviously is the percentage of availability or percentage of lack of availability of resources. So depending on how you calculate it, but obviously it's a denominator using some sort of hours of expectation of work, with a numerator being what's actually been done. And so the combination of those two values will generate a percentage calculation that you can then define and apply to your business and monitor and manage. And so we'll talk about some of the different ways OpenAir gives you the ability to set those two values and be able to create those reports. So denominator of utilization. This is a discussion we have with all our customers, is what is the base for your utilization calculation? And again, it could be far and wide. And so out of the box OpenAir, there's a couple of different standard reports that give you the ability to define a denominator right inside the report. So, and the reports that we generally see there is a user summary report, as well as there are some historical utilization reports predefined in advanced reports. So for these reports that are kind of out of the box type reports, you get a couple of different options. You get, work schedule hours and base work schedule hours. So let me define the difference between those two denominator options. Work schedule hours is, as you know, every user gets assigned a work schedule in OpenAir, and generally that work schedule includes how many hours per day a user is expected to work, as well as what are the company holidays. So for example, we had 4th of July last week. 4th of July for us was on the 3rd because it fell on a Saturday. So the work schedule hours for last week, being that I expect my folks to work 8 hours a day, was 32 hours. So if I use that as my denominator in my calculation, then that allows me to be able to define my utilization based on that 32 hours as a base. Base work schedule hours, is basically What are the number of hours per day? I don't care about holidays, right? So we're going to use a base that's going to be common to cross all resources, no matter what location they're in or what country they're in potentially. We want to kind of define a base. So in our example of last week, 8 hours a day is our expectation, 5 days a week. You would get a 40-hour base work schedule. So those are both kind of out of the box standard functionality that you can report on. And then you can go a level down lower if need be. So you might have, depending on how you're defining utilization, is it billable utilization? Is it productive utilization? You might want to exclude time off in your utilization. So in addition to the holidays, maybe if someone took PTO, instead of, if I took PTO last Thursday and I wanted to exclude my PTO hours because I was really only available to work for 24 hours last week, then I can take my work schedule hours minus my PTO time entered on my timesheet last week. So depending on, again, how you define your denominator, then you can go through and in these standard reports, you can get pretty good flexibility on being able to define. So you can see here in the screenshot, this is a screenshot of the report options on the out-of-the-box report. The one at the bottom is actually the historical utilization report, which is an advanced report, and be able to just kind of make those selections inside that report and then be able to generate those values. Most customers, however, do not use the out-of-the-box reports because they want to be able to show those utilization values across a variety of reports, not just a user summary report or an advanced report. So they may want to mix and match other values in addition to their utilization. So generally we recommend and work with customers to define utilization using custom calculations. So there's a couple of versions of custom calcs that you can do. There's custom detail fields as well as custom calcs. The custom detail field could be used if, let's say, you wanted to use 520 for a quarter. So I don't care how many weeks, I don't care how many working days, we're going to define our quarterly denominator at 520. So in that scenario, you can create a custom detail field to be able to set basically a constant of 520 for a quarterly target for your resources. The downside of using this method is you have to basically create all the different time-based values depending on the type of reporting you do. So you'd have to have a quarterly value, maybe an annual value, maybe a weekly value, maybe a monthly value. And so, and then you'd have to have multiple, calculations based on all those different values, and they would be on different reports. So we don't generally recommend this approach. However, we do have some customers that this is how they measure it, and OpenAir does give you a way to be able to hard code your hours and define the period for those hours. And then once you create those custom detail fields, then you can then create them, use them inside a custom calculation to say, my actual hours divided by this this constant we created, and it will give you that calculation for that period that you're looking for. More than likely, we get custom denominators using straight custom calcs, and this is really where we see the most customers benefiting from, because it does give you the largest variety, and it does give you the ability to run these custom calcs across multiple time periods. So it doesn't matter if you're reporting weekly or monthly or quarterly or what have you. You get the correct value in your report. So generally, it does start with determining if you're going to use the work schedule hours or you're going to use the base work schedule hours. And then from there, you can start to filter out certain hour calculations. So for example, I want to filter out vacation time or PTO or maybe some other calculation you may want to. You would be able to create all those custom calcs and be able to then have those available. Obviously, when creating a custom calc, we always recommend creating a company summary custom calc because that gives you the most flexibility in being able to use that calc in all your company summary reports. It also gives you the ability to subtotal the reports in any way you like. You know, you could maybe subtotal by department or subtotal by cost center and still be able to see all the values you're looking for. An example here, we have work schedule hours, which is our standard. And then we created a custom calc called non-billable hours. So, in doing so, we were able to take our timesheet all hours. We created a constant of 1, so timesheet all hours times 1. And then we filtered that calculation on only non-billable hours, depending on how you calculate non-billable hours, based on using a non-billable checkbox or some other value. And then from there, we created that value, and now we can take that value and apply it to our work schedule hours, and now we get a customized utilization denominator. So numerator, so again, if you go back to the standard reports, the user summary or the standard advanced reports, you do get a lot of options, using different values. Mostly when you're using utilization, you want to limit to timesheets if you're looking backwards, and then have those timesheets potentially filtered based on the flavor of utilization you're looking. However, if you're looking forward, you want to look based on either bookings or bookings with actuals or hours, assigned hours if you're using task assignments to drive future. So again, these are all basically pre-built standard values that you can select, but these are only available in a select set of reports, such as user summary reports or advanced utilization reports. This is generally not the way we see customers moving, but these are available. Generally gets back to a custom calc, handling these types of things. So for example, I want to create a billable utilization calculation, right? So again, I can go back to my little trick of creating, I need a value for billable hours. So how do I create a billable hours field, value that I can throw in any report and show the value, but I can also use it in combination with other fields to create my utilization calculation. So generally we see, different flavors. Some customers will want to say productive, some customers will want to manage, sales time spent as a percentage of all overall time spent, within an organization or within a group. So you can basically dream to your delight on how the different values you want to hear, and custom calcs give you that ability to create all those different hours categories depending on how you set the system up. And there's a few ways we see customers setting the system up. I would say task types are the most common. So these are really where you create tasks on projects, and then you define a list of task types based on the different categories that you want to report hours on. So, and then within those tasks, you assign whether it's billable, productive, if it's PTO, sales, what have you, whatever those flavors of hours you're looking for, define in those tasks. And then users, basically, they're just selecting a task on their timesheet, and then by definition, that time's getting stamped with those task types, and then you can then roll those up into these reporting values. We've also seen time type is another good option, but the difference between task type and time type is time type actually becomes a pick list on the actual time entry. So in that scenario, the user's actually selecting, is this billable, is this non-billable, or is this productive, et cetera, depending on the values you select. So that's another way to do it, depending on if you want to give your user the ability to select those values versus them inheriting it just by choosing a task that you can use. Now, not all utilization measurements are the same. So, for example, you might have a support folks that enter their time in open air where their billable targets might be 60%. And then you might have, your billable folks who might be 80%. And so, but you want to be able to see how are we doing as an organization across all the different groups, and not have to say, oh, let me figure out, how support group is doing versus how my travel consulting group is doing, and then, not really have apples to apples because of the percentages that change. Well, that's where really target utilization feature really comes into play. Is by setting a target on each user, you can basically, you define a new reporting value in the system. So in this example, right, the target utilization is set for this individual at 75%. Once you assign enable this target utilization feature, and this is actually not a switch, it's something that can be enabled yourselves from an admin perspective under a general preferences, I believe, on the global settings page. And then you define those, and it creates two different values now. It creates a value called target hours and base target hours. So target hours basically is equivalent of your work schedule hours, but it's multiplied times your target utilization, versus where base work schedule hours would be just all the hours, 8 hours a day, times, in this case, 75%. So that kind of gives you the ability to set your numerator across different groups. So if I have a 50% target, but someone else has a 75% target, both of us using target hours, both of our goals is to get to 100%. And by getting to 100%, we're 100% of our target. So now I can report across my different departments and groups and be able to, compare apples to apples based on target set. So target utilization is a great way to be able to harmonize your reporting and the reporting values. You can also include those in reports. So even if you're not using target hours or base target hours, if you're doing utilization reports, you can include as a detail field in that report what the target is for a particular user. And then from there, you can kind of compare. You can do calculations where you say, show me what they did minus their target, what's their delta. So there's all kinds of different calculations you can create using target hours. It's also a good way for people to be able to run self-utilization reports on their dashboard. So you create these, reports using filter sets to limit what data people can see, and then they can kind of monitor their own utilization, potentially using utilization as a bonusable value metric. Folks can use these reports out of the box and be able to run them and just say how they're doing, so they can keep track and hopefully meet their goals. So putting it all together, you want to take all this great data you've generated and you want to be able to kind of visualize it. So we talked about, if you look at the top graph, different categorizations of time. So for example, if I look here, I see my billable utilization, which is my tallest column, is what that is, and that looks good. But I'm also concerned because my admin percentage is quite high. So that would give me a kind of a cause for pause to say, maybe I need to dig into that and see where my admin time is being spent, so that I can maybe do something to get that down a little bit. So this is a great being able to run this and look at this and keep track of this. You can also use all this data to track trends. So how are we doing month over month with our utilization across a group of folks? So trending is great for being able to see. And again, because you can use targets, we can say, everyone's goal is, goals may be different, but this report is looking for everyone to get to 100% of their goal. And now I can basically, group my entire organization together and say, where are we spiking, where we have lulls in our utilization, and dig into those numbers and see where we are. So you can kind of get a nice, really nice trend. Lastly, you can basically look at your utilization per employee and be able to compare those and rank the folks as, so, and then again, using target utilization, you can look at this by individual or by team and be able to keep an eye on those. So these are just some few examples, utilization measurements and viewing. I could speak for hours, but these are just a few quick examples. So mostly what we've been talking about to this point is looking backwards, right? How are folks doing? You also have the ability to look forward, and you can do that. Again, some of the standard reports allow you to have those values out of the box. But generally what we see is creating some custom calcs that allow you to look forward. And so depending on how you're planning your forward-looking demand or capacity rather, if you're using bookings or if you're using assignments, you can use those hours, calculate what your denominator is going to be for those future periods using work schedule or base work schedule. And then you can also factor in target if you need to using target hours. You can actually create these calculations and look forward to see how are my folks looking in the coming weeks. So I can quickly see across here that Tim Foster is 100% scheduled over the next few weeks, but I can see that Rebecca's overscheduled, Ed's got a little bit of time, Juan's got a good amount of time short term. So it's a great way to kind of manage your capacity. You could add potentially FTE reporting to the same report to kind of get your overall capacity for your different groups. So getting these kind of future utilization reports, that mimic your billable utilization reports, if that's what you're trending, will give you that ability to do that. So of course, when you're looking at future capacity, you have to think about, we talked a little bit about this in the last webinar, you can think of the hours available, and I like using the target utilization because if my teams are 75% targeted to meet, then that's my target capacity for those future fields. Again, you can report on FTEs as well. So, if I'm using generics to kind of be placeholders for future work, and then using job codes behind the scenes to kind of bind everything up, being able to do counts in OpenAir, which we covered in our last webinar, that gives you that kind of full 180, 360-degree view of your future capacity. And, when do I need to hire, or where do I have spikes in work where I'm going to need to bring in contractors? And so it helps you kind of get to make those types of decisions. You also want to use, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but you want to identify employees versus subcontractors anytime you're looking forward. Also, when you're measuring utilization, generally we omit subcontractors from our utilization reports because they generally don't have an expected amount of hours in their denominator. So generally they're 100% because they're always working with just what they need to work. So, and being able to identify those either at a user level or potentially using a tag, an entity tag to define. And entity tags are great because they give you the ability to say, I was an employee for this period and I moved to a subcontractor for this period or vice versa. So maybe I converted, and between these dates, I was an employee. And so within those dates, I show up in reports, but then I somehow created myself as a subcontractor and moved on. So it keeps you from being able to have to create multiple records, which is certainly another option. But if you don't want to create multiple records and you just want to use a tag to be able to track that, that's a really good way to do it. You can also use start and end date. So I'm an employee as of a certain date. And so if I start mid-month, it would allow you to filter on only the hours where I was an employee, and that would allow me to, decrease my denominator so that I'm getting an accurate utilization versus, skewing the whole month because I didn't even start the first couple of weeks. Bill rate, obviously you can use, capacity based on billable, so you could set up an expected bill rate for your users and be able to track, based on if they're 75% and they're expected to bill at $100 an hour, what is my expected bill rate going to be in the coming months, or what's my expected capacity based on the amount of revenue that you can set. So on the user rate, there is an hourly rate on a user demographic that can be set. Just be careful if you're using any sort of user-based time billing rules. It will do the default value. You could also steal a cost value from the cost table and set an expected bill rate there, and then be able to use that to look forward for capacity based on expected revenue. And then once you get these values cooked in your system, then you can start to group your capacity by job codes, or by department, by full-time, part-time, and that's really where, you know, you now have that flexibility to be able to create those reports and then ultimately create those different charts and graphs and dashboards for you know, seeing that data quickly. And that's really where, if you're using the custom calcs, you get max flexibility on how to group the data together and what data to group into the report. So very powerful. Obviously, you know, as you are looking forward, you need to be keeping an eye on, you know, different types of resources that you want to, you know, skill profile database is a great way to be able to track different different types of resources based on different details. And you can kind of use some of that in your reporting. Entity tags, as I mentioned earlier, is another really good way to say, you know, my employee, or was I employed, you know, what department is another good value here. And you can use all these entity tags, you know, basically think of it as a custom field with a start and end date. And you can use those all in your custom calculation filters or within report filters to help really kind of hone in the data you're looking for. It is important that if you're using these entity tags, that you do maintain those as people move. You know, if someone moves departments and you try and track, they started in this department on this date and they moved to another department on another date, it's important to make sure someone's responsible for going in and making those changes, or as, you know, as employees leave the company, terminating them and moving them, you know, dating their employment. So those are all kind of important, you know, housekeeping items that need to happen for, you know, for you to get good data. We have done some scripting, by the way, on some of these tags to help set the tags based on other values set on the user record. So, you know, potentially if you're looking to automate that, it is possible. And this is just kind of an output of demand, of a report you can do looking at demand by entity tag or by job code or by skills. You can get some, you know, down to some of the FTE level looking forward. And this is another view, same as FTE, but this is looking at future scheduled hours. So either booked or assigned hours, you know, looking at those into the future. You can also do booked with actuals or assigned with actuals. So you can kind of get an idea of how we're doing current month versus what are our expectation in future months. So this is another way to spread the hours across different demand based on, you know, job codes or based on generic resources. So in summary, there are lots of flavors of utilization, and OpenAir supports them all. So if you find yourself dumping data out of OpenAir and massaging it in spreadsheets to try to get to a utilization, by the time you're done, more than likely the data is stale. And the awesome thing about using OpenAir to be able to create these reports and views is you've always got up-to-date data. As soon as someone puts their time in, you know, your data is up to date. So it's you know, great option there. Make sure you're looking at some of these standard features, you know, that help you influence these utilization reports. You know, we talked about entity tags and target utilization. These are all great features that you have access to them. They don't cost anything, and they really can help you hone in this utilization and capacity. And speaking of capacity planning, you can do capacity planning in OpenAir. It is a realistic thing, and we have we do it ourselves. We help our customers achieve that. So, you know, it is something you can do. It's not required that you dump data in Excel. And then lastly, you know, look at your reporting needs and drive how you do it. Again, I started off with, we talked to customers before we open OpenAir. It's how do you report on utilization? What's your definition? And then we go into, once we come up with an agreed upon metric, then we go into our building and determining how the system can meet the requirements. So make sure you understand the output before you start to determine what the input looks like, and what sort of a custom value you need to create. So again, that's the content for today's webinar. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned one thing or maybe more. You know, as you all are on here and familiar with TopStep, you know, we would love to help all these professional service organizations meet their potential. So please, you know, follow us. If you don't get our newsletter, please sign up for our newsletter on our website. We do TopStep tweets. We have an enormous amount of content on our website under our resource library, where all these webinars over the years and years and years we've been doing them. live. So we also have blogs and tips and tricks and all kinds of great stuff. So please take advantage. We live to be able to provide this sort of content out to our folks. So again, I will now pause the recording and see if we have any questions.